Welcome to True Magic, the podcast where we are learning about the spiritual meaning encoded into the physical forms of creation. In lieu of another standard episode in our current season, which is slowly dwindling into nothing, we have for you another Talky Nonsense, courtesy of Smokey's pestiferous mind. My lovely wife, Smokey the Magnificent, has yet more to say on the issue of practical piety and women working outside the home.
I came across a post on Facebook a couple of days ago, and we shall read it out to you. Polly, would you like to do the honors?
This is what the post says. Your wife will never be in full submission to you until you get her out of the workforce. When your wife has a job, she's literally submitting to another man for 1/3 or 1/2 of the day. Her job has its own leader, its own policies, its own goals, and its own agenda. In other words, it is a, quote, husband with a, quote, household and a, quote, program of its own. It's with an apostrophe, I might add. If you looked at the way the workforce is structured, you will see it's structured just like a household. It has husbands, helpmeets, children, and house rules. Your wife cannot submit to 2 programs, even if it looks like she can. You think she can, because you were never on the receiving end of her full femininity and submission. She has never given you all of it, because she has to divide it between you and her job. You are receiving a piece. Maybe you're satisfied with a piece, but there's more to her. And your household would probably flourish if she was able to pour her femininity into her home instead of the workforce.
Right.
End quote.
Indeed. Now, I came across this post because it was reposted by a Facebook friend, but it was originally penned by a woman named Chanel Shalom, and having looked her up, she seems to have a very peculiar thing going on. She describes herself as a relationship coach who does marriage prep and femininity counseling. What that is, I do not know. I am too afraid to ask. But her Facebook page is kind of this weird mix of promoting her Queens of Virtue course, semi-biblical advice, life coachy stuff, and then photos of herself wearing less fabric coverage than you would expect from a Queen of Virtue. So it's very strange and would not recommend in general. But the point of this episode isn't to bash her specifically. It was an eloquent statement of an argument we have heard articulated by many more solid conservative people all over the place before. And I can see...
Like, for example, the man who shall remain nameless who shared this quote.
Well, indeed. I mean, and it was liked by plenty of people, and I can see why they did. And I can see why her point was made. So, many, maybe even most women with full-time jobs at least, have them for unbiblical reasons, or at least non-biblical reasons. They might believe they can't be fulfilled without a career. They might believe they should never be dependent on a man because men can't be trusted. Often their grandmothers have told them this after their husbands had left them. So, that's a thing. They might have been told that they'd be gold diggers if they didn't contribute financially to the marriage, and so on. And they view their careers as essentially their real work. And, family life takes a back seat to it and competes with it. And it can end up in this really unhealthy dynamic where various institutions are raising the kids and mum and dad are fighting over whether they should move to Toledo for her job or Cincinnati for his job. And then one of the kids gets sick and they argue about who has to take time off work, and it all just becomes a complete disaster pants. And that is a very common phenomenon, which is worth fighting against.
Do we want to briefly elucidate for our esteemed audience just what exactly a disaster pant is?
I think it speaks for itself, don't you?
Okay.
And conversely, we do very much believe in the importance of homemaking and being very involved in your kids' education and so on. But I do think this specific argument is wrong. Essentially, the argument is that a wife who works is serving 2 masters. She can't submit to both her husband and her boss because their commands might conflict and their priorities for her time will differ. Well, the first thing to note here is that Christian wives can and do and should submit to men who aren't their husband all the time. The elders at the church, right? Or the police who stop for them for a breath check. These things are not a problem, so clearly submission of any kind isn't the problem. The implication is that a wife who works is submitting to her boss in the same way that she would submit to her husband. But there is...
I don't know. So I think it's more than an implication. It's being stated very straightforwardly that she's essentially working in 2 households and functioning as a wife to a household other than her own.
Fair enough. But there is a very giant, vital distinction between these 2 situations. The submission she has for her husband is covenantal, and the submission she has towards her boss is contractual. So we're going to talk about that.
Indeed we are, because this is actually a topic somewhat close to my heart, in the sense that it seems to be the source of a great deal of difficulty and dissension, especially in the reformed world And in my opinion, I think that it's one of the key sources of what we see as Doug derangement syndrome, where you have all these people saying that people like Doug Wilson and the Federal Vision is all just terrible heresy and screeching and clutching their pearls about it. I think that one of the main causes of that problem is traceable to this blurring of the distinction between covenants and contracts. And Reformed theology itself maybe has blurred this distinction in the past. I don't know exactly where its root is because I'm not a historical theologian, but I have definitely seen lots and lots of people thinking of covenants as contracts. And this causes all kinds of weird theological skewage. And I'm not going to go into that more here, but I'll link to an article that I once wrote in the show notes.
I remember at Sunday school learning the Heidelberg Catechism. What is a covenant? An agreement between two or more persons. Which sounds like it could incorporate contract or...
There's nothing to distinguish that from a contract.
No.
Is the problem. So it definitely goes quite far back. I think that probably the originators of the Heidelberg Catechism had a better view of covenant than the Catechism itself would hint at. But
that was the children's version.
Yeah. Over time, it definitely degenerated into the very simplistic understanding that we have today. Sufficient for the moment to say that we have tended, in my observation, to view covenants as judicial contracts rather than as familial commitments. But covenants are not judicial contracts, and we should not confuse the two. As today, contracts in ancient times, in biblical times, in the biblical thought world, were thing-oriented. They were legal agreements that assured some benefit. And as today, they specified terms and conditions which could be objectively checked so that if any party failed to perform them, they were in breach of the agreement. But this is not how covenants worked. They were, by contrast, person-oriented. And so breaches were not primarily performative, but relational. Now, this is not to say that you couldn't have performative breaches. Obviously, there are elements in the covenants where you have stipulations and blessings for keeping them and curses for breaking them. We see, for example, Moses nearly being killed by God because he had not circumcised his son as stipulated by the covenant with Abraham. But to understand the distinction that I'm expressing here, think of how the Jews managed to violate God's covenant in their hearts while being very careful to obey its outward stipulations. Performatively, they were doing just fine. If they had been under contract with God, they would have met all the terms of the contract. But in fact, they had broken the covenant, and God hated their sacrifices. He hated the fulfillment of the stipulations because covenants require above all loyalty. The performance of the outward stipulations should be an expression of that personal bond of loyalty. In other words, a contract establishes a legal bond of obligation to certain performances in pursuit of particular benefits. A covenant, by contrast, establishes a kinship bond of obligation to a person from which any benefits then flow. Elmer Martin puts this quite well. This is quoted in Peter Gentry and Stephen Willem's God's Kingdom Through God's Covenants. He says, "Both covenant and contract have obligations, but with this difference. The conditions set out in a contract require fulfillment of terms. The obligation of a covenant is one of loyalty. A ticking off of terms in checklist fashion can reveal a broken contract, and the point of brokenness can be clearly identified. A covenant, too, can be broken, but the point at which this transpires is less clear, because here the focus is not on stipulations 1, 2, 3, but on a quality of intimacy. Of all the differences between covenant and contract, the place in covenant of personal loyalty is the most striking."
This is why, for example, it would generally be a sin if a Christian husband asked his wife to iron his shirt for him and she said, "No, that's not my job." Whereas if a boss asked her to, and assuming it wasn't in her job description, it would be absolutely within her rights to decline. And that wouldn't be being sinful or bratty or even being a bad employee. That would just be her insisting on upholding the terms of their contract. It's also not a sin for a woman to quit her job. She can leave for a good reason or a bad reason, or purely just because she's not feeling it. Again, this is obviously not like marriage. I think it's easier to see if a woman has a female boss. I don't hear anyone saying that women inherently have some kind of quasi-lesbian relationship if they submit to a female boss. So why do they say it is a quasi-adulterous one if they submit to a male boss? The Proverbs 31 virtuous wife had in fact contractual relationships with other men. She supplied the merchants with sashes. Now, I highly doubt that she was swanning up as and where she pleased, with only the number of sashes she felt like doing that week. It's plausible to assume that they had some kind of basic contract, this many sashes in these fabrics and colours for this amount of money to be delivered on X date. Is there any hint in the Bible that these contractual relationships threatened her covenantal relationship to her husband? Well, quite the opposite. They're cited as proof that she's a good wife. She has increased her household's net worth by working hard, and he is proud of her. And This is true even though the merchant's profits on her sashes went towards building up their own households and not hers. This is a thing post-mill Christians can get really funny about. It's actually okay to build up other people's households as a side effect of building up your own. If a man goes to work at Walmart, it doesn't mean he's putting Walmart before his family because he has a perverse desire to expand the Walmart empire. He's just trying to put food on his own table. And if that happens to help Walmart's profits go up, well, cool, but that's not really his motivation. In fact, if you're good at what you do, you will be constantly building up other people's homes in one way or another. You might be adding value to their house by insulating it because that's your job. You might be giving them a casserole because they've just had a baby. These are good things. And we shouldn't get into this zero-sum game mindset of extreme self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency is a myth. You can't do it. You can't live well alone. We are meant to live in community. God made us to do that. It is okay to have a job and work for someone else. It's not less Christian to be an employee than an entrepreneur. Being an employee is one of the chief ways that most men love their neighbour and their families.
Yeah, there's a weird thing with a lot of Christians. I don't know if it's really post-millennial. I think it's more kind of the red pill manosphere type thing,
right,
where they feel like they have to be independent, and they have a strange view of vocation, where vocation somehow, if you're not loving your neighbor by yourself, then you're not loving your neighbor properly.
And almost like it's degrading to work for another man, which is...
But vocation has always been about loving your neighbor, and it's always been something that you do in a hierarchy of men in most cases. And the idea that you have to do it purely from within your own household is very strange. If a man works at Walmart, it makes no sense to say he's choosing work over his household. He's choosing work for his household. That's how he funds it.
And in fact, you can't really run a complex society with everyone being an entrepreneur. Even if you take sort of the household thing where maybe a man works with his sons and sons-in-law. If you want to have a large hydroelectric dam, at some point you're going to have a company that encompasses more than your household. And I think it's clear that God is okay with this and that it's not somehow a failure of society if you go and work for somebody else.
You're always going to have a mountain with someone at the top.
Indeed. And if you want to build a pyramid, takes peeps.
Takes a mountain of men to build a mountain.
Now, going back to Chanel Shalom's original post, there was a considerable bit of irony here that I don't think she even noticed. She was railing against women in the workforce, but she's in the workforce. Like, she has a job. Her entire Facebook page is a business page. She describes herself not as a wife and mother or a single woman looking for a husband. I don't know her situation, but it was in terms of her job. She writes these inspirational things about how you have to choose a career that inspires you to get through the hard times because running your own business is hard. And this is aimed at women. So what's the idea? Like, if I had to bet money, I would say that she genuinely doesn't see herself as having a job because she works from home. Because jobs are bad, and so her thing isn't a job, it's an empowering work-from-home opportunity. She can do it while being a full-time helpmate. Well, yeah, okay. So, Non and I both work from home to some degree. Non's full-time job is all done from home, and it's a real job, it's the one that pays the bills. And here's the thing. We like that he can work from home, but the idea that you can easily, seamlessly integrate work and parenting and running a house is nonsense. Do you agree?
If you are working in something very different to what I'm doing, I imagine that you probably could integrate a lot more of the household into it, because you could have various children doing certain aspects of the job.
Yep, physical work.
But
certainly.
I do web design.
Indeed.
And writing.
As many, many people who work from home do. If you think of a work from home person, you think of them in front of a computer screen in an office. And when you're coding a website, you are not having a heart-to-heart talks with children about how their spiritual lives are going, and you are not mowing the lawn, you are working. And everybody who's worked from home, especially on computer-type work, brain work, will tell you how incredibly difficult it is to do it with kids around, without quiet, without your own space. We saw this during the pandemic. People were just going nuts because they just didn't have a place to work. I have, if you like, 2 jobs. I write for True Magic, and I work for a couple of hours a week, out of the home, at a cafe. You know which one is much simpler to integrate into our home life? The cafe. I go to work once a week for 4 hours, non-vaguely supervised with the children, who are old enough to largely do their own thing for that long. I come back. I don't think about it much in between times. I get paid a small but predictable amount of money. We get various perks that make the job worthwhile. It's easy. Whereas writing, that's the hard one. If I get inspired to write something when the kids are at the computer doing their schoolwork, or when I'm meant to be making dinner, or one of the kids needs his maths mark, well, that's when it gets difficult.
Or you're supposed to be researching for our next actual episode.
Precisely. But I am not actively parenting when I'm writing. I may be able to swap the laundry over or stir the soup every now and then, and I am sort of physically present in a way that CPS won't take the kids away. But that's kind of about it. And even that breaks my flow, because in fact humans really aren't very good at multitasking. Tell them about multitasking, Lily.
The way I put it in one of my sermons is that God has not designed us as chameleons.
Right.
Chameleons are able to use their eyes independently and look at two things at once. We are not. The way that we are designed, as you should know if you've been listening to this podcast, it means something. The fact that we can only fix both of our eyes on one thing at a time definitely means something. And multitasking is this myth that we have invented in the hope of somehow alleviating our guilt over inefficiency and our inability to focus for long periods of time on a single thing. But our brains and our eyes are not designed to be able to do two things at once. It is physically impossible to do two things at once unless they are something completely mindless, like you're busy folding the washing while listening to a podcast, for instance. Okay, I'll grant that that is a form of multitasking, but if you are doing real work, it is essentially impossible to do two types of real work at once.
Don't you say it takes 20 minutes between each interruption to get yourself back into the flow or something?
If you're really in a flow state, it definitely can take up to 20 minutes to get back into that if you get interrupted. And there've been a lot of studies on the effect of multitasking or task switching is the way that they put it. It's not that you're trying to do two things at once. It's just every time you try to switch to a new task, it adds an extra level of cognitive load. And I think the 20 figure actually comes from 20%. So it's like you're adding 20% of cognitive load on top of the task that you're doing just by switching tasks. So once you've tried to switch 5 tasks, you've basically doubled the amount of mental capability that you need, and it's completely counterproductive.
And then you have to go inside and eat cookies.
Yeah, for example.
Now, we're not dissing working from home, but I do
Quite the contrary.
No, I mean, we do it. But I think if you're a woman who is going to do this because you feel it is more virtuous and so forth than an out-of-home job, you need to be very honest about it, just as you would with an out-of-home job. You have to say things like, okay, I have a toddler. If I left my toddler with a nanny and that nanny spent 3 hours a day on the computer, would I be happy with that level of childcare? Well, if I'm going to get these wedding photography edits done, for example, for my client, I'm going to be doing that. Am I okay with that? I'm going to be physically present, but I'm not going to be mentally present. And you also have to be honest about the fact that no job important enough to actually make you money will leave you truly free. I've done one job before, one job that was legitimately self-directed. I could do it absolutely whenever and wherever I wanted, as little or as much as I liked. But you know what that job was? It was filling out surveys for like $1 a survey. It was flexible because the stakes were so low that like nobody cared. Any real job, any job that will be significantly contributing to your household will mean that you have a boss, even if you don't think you have a boss. Your boss will be whoever pays you. It could be the patrons on your Patreon account who demand content once a week, or the AdSense algorithms you have to feed by making SEO-rich blog content on a regular basis. If that's still a thing, do we still do SEO?
SEO has become kind of a scam. Most Google search results are just Reddit search results rebranded for Google or predictive algorithms.
Well, then that's a skill I now will never use again. What a shame. Anywho, the fact that you work from home and make your own hours will not prevent you from saying every now and then things like, honey, can you take the baby? I have to get this article done by midnight. Or, I can't come to the play date. Sorry, I have to ice the birthday cake. It's being picked up by 3. So you still have to ask, is it worth the sacrifice for our family? And you know what? It might be. This is another thing that bugs me about the discussion of women and work. There's a feeling that the household doesn't include monetary productivity from the woman. So if she does do something that makes money, that's only okay as long as it doesn't take away a single iota from the rest of the household, which we've now defined as all the household which exists for her. There have to be no downsides, no cons, only pros. So even in a situation like the family really wants to visit their native Italy and see their grandmother again before she dies, and the mother could make this happen by picking up a part-time job at the travel agency for 6 months, and all the kids are in school and the house is in order and her husband's cool with it, well, like, okay, but if it might mean that one time she has to pick pizza up on the way home for dinner, then that's it. It's over. She's betrayed the household. Any good that might have come from the arrangement is outweighed by this moral fact that if she weren't at work, that dinner would have been homemade. And this is really just insane. We don't treat any other aspect of household running like this. Every deployment of resources, including a productive wife, has pros and cons. I made homemade pasta the other night. It was delicious. It was also more expensive and time-consuming than buying pasta. So was I contributing to the household, or was I stealing from it for my own selfish purposes? What about if I involved the kids so they learned how it was done and had some part in the fruitfulness of our home? And you can ask the same question about keeping chickens, or putting the kids in extracurricular activities, or going to the gym, or having your son do BattleBots. We weigh these things up. We take a broad view of household and we say, is this thing a net positive or negative? And then we reassess as needed. Now, by the same token, I think we women in particular can be inclined to be a tad deluded about how much our part-time jobs are actually helping. It's a very common thing for a wife to be a stay-at-home mum, and then when money gets tight, for her to think, oh, I feel bad, how can I help? And come up with the bright idea to sell essential oils or start a blog. And then find that while it takes up just as much time as a real part-time job with 3 times the stress, you're actually making $18 a month, or, minus $300 because you got sucked into an MLM. And you're completely disrupting the household, you're still broke, and your husband feels bad about telling you to knock it off because now you're super emotionally invested and you've got 3 followers last week, so, you're convinced it's going to take off at any point. We need to be clear-eyed about what's a hobby, what's a job, and what's in some cases actively a scam. Now, I also know there are those who feel like women shouldn't contribute financially at all. The man is the provider, and not only has he failed if he asks a woman to contribute, but a godly woman would be letting him abdicate responsibility if she volunteers or even consents to contribute. I've actually seen this said, so even if the family's starving and about to be homeless, she should not, must not, cannot get a job, not even a work-from-home job, no, nothing that will make money, because that's his role. She should pray that her husband will be a better provider, and he should go out there and get like a 2nd or 3rd job and work himself into the grave, because those are the roles God gave. The idea is that no good can come of one person taking over a role meant for another. It's sort of like we don't want the state to take over when the family fails. So I get the logic, but all I can say about that is it's not only historically aberrant, but biblically aberrant. I mean, again, Proverbs 31, her husband didn't seem to feel he was abdicating his responsibility by letting her, or possibly even asking her, to sell her sashes. There is no hint in the text that she is usurping his role or that he is dropping the ball. It probably would never have occurred to him to worry about it, because in every mindset except the post-industrial, a wife making money was just like a wife making cider or quilts or preserves or babies. It was all just resources for the household. It's only in modern times that anyone would draw this sharp moral divide between a wife who grows cabbages and corn and a wife who grows more cabbages and then sells half of them and buys corn. It's crazy.
All that said, we're not suggesting that it's a good idea for every wife to rush out and get a job,
Not
obviously. The general thrust of the argument that women should not be working in the workforce as career people is a good one. We agree with that. But it's this specific reasoning, this specific line of thinking that says that women can't be in some way contributing to the household monetarily, or can't be out in another quasi-household like a corporation at any point, because that will be in some sense quasi-adulterous. It doesn't make sense. It is a blurring, a confusion, an equivocation of contract and covenant. There are obviously a ton of issues that you need to think through. Certainly you don't want your household income relying too heavily on a wife's job. Certainly a man must provide for his household, or he is worse than an unbeliever. If the wife is in her childbearing years, she should be focused on children. Children do happen, and they need to be taken care of and raised up.
And also, you don't want her to rely on a job that could immediately go kaput when you have a baby.
Indeed. The Bible is clear the burden of provision rests on a man in a way that it doesn't on a woman, but we don't want to cover all those issues today. Today we wanted to really focus on this problem of equivocating contract and covenant and how it leads to a pathological and foolish mindset about the household when you compare it to the rest of society. So that is what we have for you today. And we hope that you find it helpful. If you have questions or comments, you can leave them here on this episode if you're listening on the web, or you can go to truemagic.nz and you can find it and you can put questions and comments there. Or if you would like to get more involved in the discussion, you can also go to truemagic.nz and follow your nose to become a paid subscriber and get access to our Signal group, which is amazing. It has lots of lovely people.
It does.
Until next time, continue to present your bodies a living sacrifice, which is your spiritual service. This has been True Magic.